Hey you, come here. You ever notice that there's a massive problem in the Dungeons & Dragons community? One that has gone far too long unspoken of and unaddressed. Because you know that feeling that you get sometimes when interacting with other Dungeons & Dragons players, or when you watch a YouTube video where a creator is giving their opinion on the game, or even when you watch your favorite actual play. You know the feeling I'm talking about. Sometimes it's like a voice in the back of your head. These people are idiots. They have no idea how to play Dungeons & Dragons. Well, I'm here to tell you right now that you're absolutely correct. All of those people are idiots. They are 100% wrong. Everybody, everyone but you is wrong. They are playing Dungeons & Dragons wrong. Isn't that great to know? Of course, that's partly because everybody is playing Dungeons & Dragons wrong. Even you, even me. Oh, that kind of hurts the channel a little. And this is a bit of a problem for Hasbro and Wizards of the Coast, especially if they're looking to corral us all into a cattle pen just as they sharpen the knife. Yes, that is indeed my analogy for 1D&D. They're gonna cut us. You see, the reason for this is that there was an D&D that we've sort of left behind. Gary Gygax, Dave Arneson, they created Dungeons & Dragons, and they had a very particular idea of what the game looked like. When they dungeon mastered, which is now a verb, their games, they did so from behind plywood screens, like a medieval priest with a Home Depot budget. And they played this way so that the player characters in their adventuring parties couldn't see them DM at all, except for the occasional glimpse of a pizza grease-stained hand emerging to hand over dice that needed to be rolled in order to determine the resolution of some, perhaps, fatal check. The original intent of the creators of Dungeons & Dragons was for the Dungeon Master, or referee, to merely act as an impersonal actor that narrated the exploits of the party. And to be frank, while a bit novel now, that also sounds like a game that I wouldn't enjoy. It sounds a little bit ghoulish to me. I like to look my players in the eye when I tell them that their character is dead. But it does make sense that if you perceive Dungeons & Dragons to be a game focused on exploring a hidden map simply through the aid of verbal directions coming from a referee, that's your game, right? Dungeons & Dragons was originally intended to be a game about dungeon exploration. I guess the clue was in the name. But not everybody has or wants a confessional booth in their kitchen, and most people don't play Dungeons & Dragons that way anymore. Ask the average D&D player who their party mapper is, and you'll draw a blank look. That, by the way, is the player whose job it is to draw out the map as the party explorer. Hell, the idea of the party having a designated caller is anathema to most people's experience of the game now. The caller, by the way, was envisioned to be the party receptionist in charge of collecting all the other players' decisions in a round and communicating them to the GM. We've sort of lost these party rules. That culture has been gone for a while. Things in the Dungeons & Dragons community have changed since those days. And this is all before we even start talking about, oh no, it's Matt Mercer! Yeah, so Critical Role. That was pretty big, wasn't it? There are now entire groups of players raised not only on the 3,000 supplement books of 3rd edition, like I was, but by the one extremely handsome man with a pair of eyebrows that just won't quit. And I'll say this much about the Gary Gygax versus Matt Mercer school of DMing. I'm pretty sure that I could figure out how to build a hidden DM nook in my kitchen like Gary Gygax always imagined. But I still don't think I could convincingly voice a cowboy named after a sex offender. Yeehaw! You wanna come in my cubicle? Well, I'm not giving you a choice. There's a snake in my pants. But I suppose to get on to Matt Mercer's level, I'm gonna need a decade of voice acting is my point. So we have the old school in the Gygax dungeon crawl versus the new wave in Matt Mercer and the silly eyebrows. Two axioms, two cultures opposed to one another, except not directly, because actually there is a continuum between these two positions and beyond these. I I bet there's dungeon masters out there who scoff at the idea of speaking to the players at all. No, I will DM from another room and we shall exchange notes. Just like there's probably players out there who likely play games and refuse to answer any questions unless it's addressed to them in character. Jim, there's someone on the phone for you. I know not of this Jim you speak of. My name is Toggle. What wondrous device do you present? Jim, your sister's been in a really serious accident. What? Yeah, but this culture war, which I'm gonna call it right now, I'm gonna go full gutter press tabloid muckraker on this one. That's just the surface, because these are just two axioms of what Dungeons and Dragons Soul is, but there's also the question of everything else. Once we've settled into whether we want our game of Dungeons and Dragons to look more like a dungeon crawl or a pantomime, we then have to settle all the actual details of Dungeons and Dragons. There are people who have built entire platforms, entire personalities on the idea that Dungeons and Dragons is primarily a dice game first and a funny accent game second, which as a person who has practiced a very bad French accent and an equally bad Southern drawl, simply to deploy them in every single game possible, I can only disagree. But it goes further into even smaller questions. Should we use miniatures in our game? Gary Gygax didn't. I'm not sure if Matt Mercer does. I do though, sometimes for some games. Should player characters be easily killed? Should I be allowed to sing a dirty limerick every time we kill a goblin? I don't have an answer to these questions. I know my opinions on these topics. I share them very often on this channel. But ultimately, no one, not even Kyle Brink, knows how to really play D&D. And that's because Dungeons and Dragons, or more specifically, every single tabletop role-playing game, is a game unlike any other. We aren't playing a video game. We're not playing a board game. Sure, we can trace the lineage of Dungeons and Dragons to the war games of Prussia, or perhaps even to Victorian parlor games, or some weird blend between the two. But as an act of play, what we are engaged in is wholly unique. Unlike chess, Warhammer, darts, or Turkish oil wrestling, there's no objective. We can't win a game of D&D. And just because someone knows all the rules inside the player's handbook and is able to recite them verbatim doesn't mean that they know how to play. Just like knowing that you have to get both hands fully down the other guy's tight leather trousers doesn't make you a Turkish oil wrestler. Every single player and GM inevitably has a slightly different view on how the game should work. For some players, the idea of having two rogues in a party is a deeply frustrating experience as they struggle with an overlapping role. Whereas for others, the idea of a party made entirely of rogues sounds like a lot of fun. And I've found that as I've played in many different groups, that every single one of them has a different culture, a different level of what is acceptable. These truths, house rules, interpretations of rules, all a body of jurisprudence, many of which would be alien to other groups. D&D, TTRPGs, they are all inconsistent forms of media. However, for game designers, for the team at Wizards of the Coast, whose job it is to put text onto a page and pretend that it has power and legitimacy, things which we as players imbue it with, it is their purpose to make any new edition of Dungeons and Dragons better. And unfortunately, that comes fraught with danger, because by the very nature of the game, they will need to establish how the game is intended to be played. The big question. And then they need to implement thousands of little choices that will speak to that game design. The little questions. And for every single answer that they have for those big and little questions, they will inevitably alienate and annoy the tens of thousands of players who differ in their interpretation. For example, take the druid. Druids can turn into animals, or rather druids in D&D can turn into animals. I don't think that this guy can wild shape, but it would be pretty metal if he could. Wild shape has never really been done in a way that makes everybody happy. When druids could turn into monster stat blocks straight from the monster manual, players who believe in class balance didn't like it. When they gained a few stat bonuses on a claw attack, players who prefer the class fantasy didn't like it because it didn't really feel like turning into a bear. And now we're seeing this battle play out yet again in the 1 D&D playtest for druids as the designers show us their interpretation of what wild shaping is. There are expectations that the D&D designers are going to be using even if most people have never even played a game under those expectations. Traps are a great example of this because they're spoken about as if they're core to the D&D experience, but almost every single group that I've ever belonged to has absolutely hated them and minimized their use in play. Or the D&D designers might balance the classes of the game with no real way of telling how anyone is going to actually engage with those classes. For example, the value of refreshing all of your abilities on a short rest means nothing if, by and large, the party only has one big fight per long rest. A problem that has continually plagued D&D 5th edition design. A higher base move is kind of irrelevant if a group plays Theater of the Mind instead of on a battle map. Rangers are basically useless because lots of GMs want to handwave wilderness travel away because it gets in the way of the story that they want to tell. The gameplay loop of D&D is different depending on who you're playing with, and we can't even tell why people play certain classes. What attracts somebody to something will be different for all of those individuals. The Paladin, for example, is a holy warrior who gains their powers from a god or something. In 5th edition, a Paladin who breaks their oaths has no hard-written punishment in the book. There is a sidebar saying that the GM may choose to force the player to change class or make them an oath breaker, but there's no hard, fast rule. In older editions, however, a Paladin who broke the code, for example by having an evil teammate or something, they would lose access to their abilities until they had undertaken an atonement. Some players want this in their Holy Warrior Monk, whereas others are of the Belcar Bitterleaf persuasion of what kind of stupid class loses their abilities because of someone else's actions. And this has led to a few issues with Dungeons and Dragons. Firstly, many of the adventures are just simply left open to the interpretation of the DM, with a laissez-faire, you figure it out sidebar. Not so great when you're forking over plenty of cash to basically be told how to run Spelljammer. I was kind of hoping that you guys would tell me how to run Spelljammer. It's Spelljammer. How do I fly a spaceship? But it's also why the D&D design team these days are so obsessed with player surveys and gaining feedback, because they're aware that the game is so nebulous, so open to interpretation, so dependent on being implemented by different groups with different cultures and different styles of play and different opinions, that it's very easy for a designer to get things catastrophically wrong. The old school fans, the Critical Role fans, the 3.5 refugees, those wistful for 4th edition, the perverts, and many other different kinds of players, they all want different things from this game. We're not a player base or a fandom, we are a coalition of the unwilling. So when we get into arguments around questions of whether there should be player death, should TTRPG characters be easily killed, we need to remember that the only answer is, it depends. We're talking about fundamentally different game styles, one that isn't even on a single axis. There's like 30,000 different points of disagreement here, and no one is wrong, really, so long as everyone sat at a table knows what they want. Do you want to be whipped by an angry dungeon mistress and told when to roll the dice, and if you roll a 1 your character dies, and you have to assign one single person to liaison and converse with the DM on behalf of the party? Well then, you do you, king, you find that party out there. The game is ultimately indefinable and cannot be boiled down to a right or wrong answer. Every party will practice this type of play differently, hence why the importance of a session 0. So, you know, good luck trying to distill that down into an app, Wizards of the Coast, because it's gonna be really hard. And if you ever see someone playing Dungeons and Dragons wrong, or in a way that you fundamentally disagree with, well, I think it helps to remember that Dungeons and Dragons role-playing games, they're ultimately just a way to distract us from the fact that our existence is meaningless, and in 1,000 years all our words and deeds will have turned to dust. So, you know, play a fucking elf. I don't give a shit. Something I'm very clear on in this video. And if you want to support the critical independent content that I'm creating here on this channel all about role-playing games, then check out my Patreon at patreon.com/discourse miniatures, and a huge thanks to Sonic Bread, Crypto Kev, and to all my patrons. Bye-bye!